On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jen Kodner. She is a talent partner at Threshold Ventures and DFJ Growth. We're going to be talking about leadership hiring. We're going to be touching some areas around, finding the right person at that right growth phase, which I think is really critical. What makes for a successful leadership hire, and also, how do you go about professionalizing a function, especially if you're a founder or you're at a startup? You have to go about separating some of those responsibilities that are maybe very easy and common to you into more formal roles for somebody else. Jen, thanks for being on the show to chat with us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Threshold Ventures, DFJ Growth. Tell us a little bit more about the type of companies you guys invest in over there, and what is the relationship? Because there's two different, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with that and then work my way to the beginning of the question. So I joined DFJ almost 6 years ago, and kind of under that DFJ umbrella, there was DFJ Growth and DFJ Venture. Venture was early stage. Growth was still venture, but kind of mid-stage, like Series B plus. And by the way, they were two funds under one firm. So separate fundraising cycles and that whole thing. About 3-4 months after I joined the firm, DFJ Venture went out for a fundraising cycle and decided to spin out from underneath the DFJ umbrella entirely. And so what happened is, kind of during that fundraising journey, we took funds 11 and 12, DFJ Venture funds 11 and 12, brought them over to Threshold. Those are now Threshold 1 and 2. We raised Fund 3 in spring of 2019. And we're now investing out of Threshold Fund 4, which we raised about 2 years ago. So it was one firm. Now it's two completely separate firms. No relationship other than that myself and our CFO and her subsequent team, we split our time between the two firms. And then to answer the question of what each firm does. So obviously, both technology focused. Threshold, we lead and or co-lead typically the Series A. And the two main buckets we invest in are both enterprise software, so anywhere from infrastructure all the way to kind of the application layer, so B2B SaaS, and then health tech. So we're not really in the bio space. It's really more kind of platform and software on the health side. DFJ Growth, as mentioned, is kind of mid to late stage venture. So it's a larger fund, and we have more investment theses there as a result. So definitely investing in enterprise software, B2B SaaS, security, infrastructure, health tech, although we call it life tech there, climate, and defense tech. I think I'm probably forgetting a couple, but anyway, that's the broad sweep.
That's a lot to have on your plate, and obviously, you see lots of companies, and lots of companies are growing and have to obviously bring in leaders at various phases. And this conversation is kind of aimed at, companies at a little bit earlier stage, right? And startups that are trying to formalize leadership roles and whatnot. I guess if there's a founding team, at some point, they might want to break out pieces of leadership and find someone to come take that over. And as you're kind of, cutting around these different pieces, it's not always clean. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that process. I know you work with a lot of founders to go through this process, but that process of trying to professionalize a particular set of activities for someone that on the outside looking in will want to do it.
If I kind of put this in the context of an early stage company, so Series A, right after we invest, typically when we get into one of those companies, and this is not always the case, but typically when we get into one of those companies, it's usually, there's a co-founder or two. One of them is leading the company as a CEO, and the other is typically the CTO. They may have kind of a head of eng as well, who also might be a co-founder. And then there sometimes are, a smattering of sales individuals, like account executives, and maybe a marketing person, and, kind of a lot of engineers. And typically after we make this investment, because at the time we invest in these companies, like there is product market fit, there is some, level of revenue run rate in the company. So we're already past that. So typically when we invest, they're wanting to hire their first sales leader. So that's kind of the first thing that I typically see, and we typically see as we invest in these companies, because most of the time, before we get there, founders are really kind of running sales as they should be. And then, kind of once they hit a certain milestone, then it's time to bring in and professionalize the sales function. So that's what I see as kind of the next hire, or the, kind of the first like main executive hire other than a founder at the stage that we invest. And typically, I was just talking to a guy today who's like loves being kind of the first head of sales into companies. And I was like, what are the, kind of what was different, 5 years ago versus now as you come in as a first head of sales? He's like, all of these founders are also wanting me to carry a bag in addition to, bringing on reps. I'm like, yeah, we're encouraging them to, have their heads of sales not only run the team, but also carry a bag, i.e. player coach. So
I was actually thinking about that as soon as you were talking about carrying a bag. And I'm like, that player coach is difficult because as the founder, you almost have no choice but to be the player coach. Like it is yours. You have that skin, and obviously you get equity when you join. But they're two different contexts, and I always think about these player coach roles and the context switching and how expensive they are. Because if you're gonna have let's say the sales leader example, you want him to be a little bit strategic. You want him to put on that hat and strategize with you beyond some of those high level calls. But you also want this sales leader to be out there, beating the pavement, finding those opportunities, which is a completely different mindset. How do you help founders, or how do you help even those initial hires understand that player coach and that context switching is something that they need to, if they don't already know or embrace, that they're going to have to come to terms with?
I think it's part of what you sign up for at a company this stage. And the other thing I tell our founders, which it's going to sound harsh and I don't mean it to be, but you bring in this head of sales, they're your first head of sales hire. You have a set of, this is what we want you to do. We want you to, double ARR in the next 12 to 18 months. We want you to retain, X percent of our existing customer base and then bring on, X number of net new, customers into the fold. And so you kind of set, every one of our founders does, they bring on a head of sales, like sets that in front of these people. But the thing that I always tell them is like, okay, you've set all of these milestones in front of these folks, and this person might only last 12 to 18 months in the company. And if they've achieved all of that and you both decide that it's time to part ways, then that was a success. And, I think that feels kind of weird because it's like, 12 to 18 months is not really that long of a tenure of anyone in a company. But at that time and stage of a company where it's specific, I think it is very specific to go to market. 12 to 18 months is, if they've done all that they was kind of laid in front of them, that's a success. Now, sometimes that person stays and gets layered or is able to grow, and there are all kinds of different, little tangents that could go on. But I always kind of set that stage with our founders of like, hey, if this person is there 12 to 18 months and they do what you both have agreed is what success is for them, then, it's a successful hire. Feels weird, but it actually the case.
If you're joining a company and you kind of realize that you do have this window to operate on, the definition of success is very hard, because obviously you're under the view of the founders. They only have so much runway. They need to execute. There really isn't much of a, let me tell you the sob story and let me explain to you why things didn't work out. That's not really going to work for most startups. They need you to deliver. I guess the flip side question of that is there unfair expectations? Will someone need some time? If you don't have a real strong sales function that the founders have built, and this person has to come in and do some legwork that's going to take time, is it fair to ask, and maybe this is like from the flip side of if you're going to look to take a job at an early stage startup, is it fair to ask for more time and be like, hey, I need to push back if your expectations are 12 to 18 months, you're just setting me up to fail?
Yeah, I think that's typically, I think to a certain extent, you have to set that up at the beginning. I think, 9 months in, kind of looking back and saying, this is, I actually want to kind of move I want to move the goal farther. It probably doesn't land well. I think setting those expectations up front is probably the best time to do it. Now, that being said, we can't predict the future necessarily. So there are all kinds of things that can happen that can really influence that have nothing, that have nothing to do with the actions of the founder and the head of sales. But I'd say in general, it's always important to set those up front versus, kind of wait and say, wait, just kidding, I can't do
some of the more tribal aspects. Right? I mean, every company goes through the same functions. It's just it might be envisioned differently. It might operate slightly differently, but we have the same functions across every org. Some of these, we'll call them the tribal aspects of a particular function that founders might be holding currently. Translating that to more formalized processes, I've noticed in dealing with some founders, not as to the level you have, obviously, but I've noticed that sometimes there's some friction there to go, I've done it. The founder, I've done this, I've done this role, I've done this plus these other 6 hats. You're telling me somebody who's going to be focusing on just this one particular component can't do this. And sometimes you're looking at that person going, you've just kind of learned how to deal with this Frankenstein. It's not what the industry supports. How do you help a founder understand that sometimes Frankenstein on the on the free labor market isn't quite expected?
I think that's part of a company growing up. And from my experience with founders, like there are some roles where they're happy to part with that. So, I would say sales is one of them. Marketing is kind of a mixed bag. A lot of founders, should be and are the best marketers of their company, but they're not marketing professionals. So you kind of have to delineate between like, yes, you're the evangelist, but no, you don't run marketing. And we're bringing in someone here, by the way, typically with enterprise software companies, it's product marketing lead to do that for you. So you don't have to do it. Finance is pretty easy to strip away, especially because again, the first finance hire you're making is probably like a, accountant type controller person. It's not going to be a CFO. So that one's usually pretty easy to strip away. People, kind of convincing a founder to hire a head of people at a certain point. That's a tough one. I just was talking to one of our new founders the other day and they couldn't understand why they needed to hire a head of people because they could do all these things themselves. I'm like, yeah, but you're running people, but there are all these other things you could be doing because you run the company. So like, let's peel it off and give it to someone who's actually done it before. The biggest one though, in terms of being very hard to peel away from a founder is product. And I've had so many conversations with founders where they're like, we need to hire a head of product. And it's like, okay, cool. What are you going to give up? Because in order to bring on a new leader to run product, founders have to give something up. And typically they're giving up part of their baby. And it feels kind of not good to them. So kind of helping work through the psychology of like, what are you going to give up? What are you going to keep? Can we bring in the right person to really be cool with that and kind of really partner with you and not be threatened? Is the toughest piece. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I like kind of if I think about like peeling away functions away from the founding team, like the others are like in various degrees like relatively easy. Product is the hardest one.
When you're peeling away one of these harder roles and you're looking to hire somebody, you had mentioned the right person for the right growth of phase. I guess it could be product or we could really focus on anything. But when you're starting to look at that window that a founder's hiring for, how do you help keep them from thinking too far down the road of somebody who's capable of going past a certain phase of growth and making sure that the right person can handle the current phase of growth and how much further I don't know, but how do you advise there?
Yeah, it's a tough one because I think, we all get starstruck by certain companies or backgrounds or whatever. But, and I see that with our founders, but the thing I always have to remind them of is like, cool, that person looks amazing for a 2 to, 500 person company, but you're a 25 person company and this person needs to be super hands on and they don't have any, there's no leverage. So is this someone you want to bring on today and not give them any leverage? And like, are you setting them up for success? Or do you want to bring in someone who's the next couple of levels down, who probably can't operate at the more scaled level, but is what you need today and is a good add to the culture and the whole thing? And by the way, the other thing that we kind of do to get around, the starstruck piece is like, hey, this might not be the person you hire today. However, like, let's talk to them about being an advisor. Like if they're sitting in a function that you think, could really benefit you, if you could benefit from learning from this person, like let's talk to them about becoming an advisor. And like, actually a couple of times in our portfolio, we've done that where we've had executives sit as advisors, formally or informally for a year or two within our companies. And ultimately they do end up getting hired in when the time is right and the scale is right. So I wouldn't say it's a skirt around, but it's a way to kind of keep that person engaged without having them on the payroll.
I guess as you're, hiring people, leadership structure, maybe we're at a stage where everyone's reporting into very few people. We're starting to hire teams, hire leaders that are expected to either be responsible for themselves or maybe other people. And some of that starts shifting. Some of the dynamics of, I'm no longer the person that you talk to for this, talk to this person because, they're now the head of product and they're responsible for those decisions. That's not always easy. But when you look at best practices for leadership structures and making sure that the right people are reaching out to the right individual, what are some of the structures that make sense early on?
You don't want to layer it too much. I mean, because at the end of the day, the founder for a very long time is still going to need to like see everything and approve everything because again, it's their baby. Where you can't just like completely remove responsibilities from them. But I think it's kind of, do you have someone kind of a trusted individual in a role where they can really, take on, 80 to 90% of all the things that come to them in that capacity, whether it's sales, marketing, product, people, whatever it is. Can they take all of those questions or inquiries or whatever it is, knowing that always having the assurance that the founder or CEO is going to have the ability to kind of oversee all of it and kind of see everything that comes through, but also having the assurance of someone is going to kind of deal with the day to day of it. So I think it's keeping it simple, keeping the structure simple, especially at the early stages. Like I feel like a lot of layer it doesn't make sense, but
Yeah, and you mentioned player coach. I mean, sometimes when you have player coach situations, I mean, maybe you don't want to adjust anything in the leadership structure because that individual who's the player coach, can they really also do a lot more coaching when they're being asked to wear the other hat? So I guess that's a complicated dynamic. I guess last question for you when it comes to leadership hiring, especially at this phase of startups. When you're looking at traits for what makes for a successful leadership hire, are there consistent qualities that kind of bubble up when you look back and go, well, these people turned out to be great leadership hires?
yeah. And are we still putting it in the frame of reference of an earlier stage company?
Yeah, let's keep it there since the
We'll
whole
keep
yeah, let's keep it
we'll
there.
go with that theme. I mean, I know we
Yeah.
didn't necessarily need to start that, but we'll just keep that theme. And the reason I asked that question, by the way, just to kind of give context, is earlier stage companies, like the traits are going to be a little bit different than like a later stage company where like you want scale and you want people who have seen growth. And not that you don't with earlier stage, but that scale is a little bit different. So to answer your question, traits. Yeah. So someone who's willing to kind of dig in and be hands-on and not rely on others to do things for them. Like, I mentioned leverage before, like maybe there's a little bit of leverage, but like instead of waiting around for, someone to do something for you, kind of really being able to be hands-on and do things without being overbearing. Like, that's a huge thing in terms of just kind of traits, competencies, which I see work really well, especially at earlier stage companies. I think not just saying, okay, and again, it kind of plays into my first point, which is not just saying, oh, that's not my job. I don't do that. There's somebody else who can do that. It's like, well, at the end of the day, it's a small company. And so everybody needs to be hands-on. In fact, I was in sales in the very early part of my career. And the CEO of our company was always said to everyone, which I like, it just kind of made an imprint on me is like, it doesn't matter what your job title is. Everyone at this company is a salesperson. And I always think about that as, I'm coaching our founders and talking to people about their roles. It's like, job title matters. Sure. Does it? I don't know. Early stages, yes, it matters. But like at the end of the day, everybody's a salesperson for the company. I mean, I think that applies to all stages. But I think going in with that mindset is kind of a good way to look at it. And then the other thing, especially on kind of the go to market, is like hiring specific to that industry or that kind of subset within tech. I think just kind of coming in and hitting the ground running and already having understanding of the customer base and the product is super important. And what do I mean? Like I wouldn't put a person who's been selling only security software into a B2B SaaS company selling to, sales executives. I just don't think that sets anyone up for success. I think maybe later stage for sure, but I think being more specific makes the search a little bit harder, but I think it actually ends up being a little bit more successful. So
That's some great advice, and yeah, definitely, I could see the how it's applicable to early stage startups. But I think obviously, we might have to have a follow up conversation where we talk about non early stage startup leadership traits. Like that seems like we could be opening up a whole new basket there. But I wanted to thank you for your time. I know we didn't cover everything in depth. It's almost impossible. It's a big subject matter, but you did a great job highlighting advice, best practices. If someone does want to reach out to you because they heard something and they'd like to know more of your thoughts, is there a good way of touching base with you?
yeah, LinkedIn is always the best way. I'm on it all the time. And so feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. And yes, by the way, I try to keep my answers brief just because I know I have a tendency to that. And so I'm being trying to be succinct.
Definitely. No, you were awesome. We'll include that in the show notes. Make sure people can reach you and contact you. Again, thanks for being on. And that's it for the episode. Two things. One, this was a great episode. I know we did not cover everything in depth. We got through a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different pieces of advice when it comes to leadership hiring. Please share this with somebody else who could benefit. I think it's a very applicable episode for a founder, someone in talent. Yeah, across the board, I think there's some great advice here, what to look for, what to not look for in leadership hiring, especially early stage talent. And also like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is doing. I appreciate that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.